Festivus Report 2024. Who's to blame for our crushing national debt? Everybody. This year, members of both political parties in Congress voted for massive spending bills filled with subsidies for underperforming industries, continued military aid to Ukraine, and controversial climate initiatives. As Congress spends to reward its favorite pet projects, the American taxpayers are forced to pay through high prices and crippling interest rates. The same big spenders teamed up, yet again, to continue sending Americans hard-earned money to foreign countries, funding endless wars, all while still ignoring our wide-open southern border. And our mountain of debt will continue to pile even higher. The Congressional Budget Office predicts we will add an average of $2.1 trillion in debt annually for the next decade. According to a July House Budget Committee report, the U.S. government will add over $6.4 billion of debt every single day for the next 10 years, borrowing over $268 million every hour, $4.5 million every minute, and over $74,401 every second. This year, I am highlighting a whopping $1,803,329,626.12. That's over $1 trillion in government waste, including things like ice skating drag queens, a $12 million Las Vegas pickleball complex, $4,840,082 on Ukrainian influencers, and more. No matter how much money the government has wasted, politicians keep demanding even more. As always, taking the path to fiscal responsibility is often a lonely journey, but I've been fighting government waste like Doge before Doge was cool. And I will continue my fight against government waste this holiday season. Hey, race what our Congress spent your tax dollars on. Ghost towns on the government's dime. The federal government spent $10 billion on maintaining, leasing, and furnishing almost entirely empty buildings. A pandemic plunder. A Florida man stole $8 million in COVID-19 relief funds to buy an island and more. Your tax dollars at play. The Department of the Interior, DOI, spent $12 million on a Las Vegas pickleball complex. Taxpayers fund a disinformation index. The Department of State, DOS, wasted $330,000 to fund censorship of non-liberal and conservative media. Snack attack. The Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, awarded a $2 million grant to study kids looking at Facebook ads about food. Taxpayers' dollars down the drain in Nevis. The Department of State, DOS, spent $108,272 on a non-functioning hotel. Direct file fail. Congress spent $15 million to turn the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, into an unconstitutional force to prepare, file, and audit your hard-earned money. Oh, rats! HHS spends nearly $500,000 on a depressing study of lonely, starved rats. The Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, spent $419,470 to determine if lonely rats seek cocaine more than happy rats. Hold onto your steering wheels. The Department of Energy, DOE, spent $15.5 billion to push Americans toward electric vehicles they don't want. The influencer effect hits foreign policy. The Department of State, DOS, squandered $4,840,082 on influencers. Cirque du taxpayer. The National Endowment for the Arts, NEA, spent $365,000 to promote circuses in city parks. Girls just want to have funds. The Department of State, DOS, spent $3 million for girl-centered climate action in Brazil. A State Department production featuring your hard-earned money. The Department of State, DOS, paid the Royal Film Commission $873,584 for movies in Jordan. Goalposts and grandstanding. The Department of State, DOS, spent $345,434 on football engagement to counter terrorism. When bailouts go bust, the United States Department of the Treasury, USDT, granted a failed trucking company a $700 million pandemic-era loan. Flocking together. DEI takes flight. The National Science Foundation, NSF, spent $288,563 to ensure bird watching. Groups have safe spaces, aka affinity groups. Interestingly wasteful, Americans are paying $892 billion in fiscal year 2024 on the interest on Uncle Sam's credit card. Hashtag to handouts in Ethiopia. The Department of State, DOS, spent $500,000 to expand the U.S. Embassy in Ethiopia's hashtag US invests in Ethiopian social media campaign to a larger national public relations campaign. Bibbidi bobbidi boo, there goes your tax dollars too. The federal government spent $7,026,689 on various magical projects. Because who needs a secure U.S. border anyway? The Department of State, DOS, spent $2.1 million for Paraguayan border security. The high price of highline art. Since 2015, the National Endowment for the Arts, NEA, has awarded $385,000 for art displays on the High Line. Money to manure. The Department of Agriculture, USDA, is spending $20 million on the Fertilize Right initiative to advance fertilizer use in Pakistan, Vietnam, Colombia, and Brazil. Fauci-funded feline COVID experiments. The National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, and U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, spent $2.24 million on COVID experiments. Going viral for world peace. The Department of State, DOS, is spending $123,066 to teach Kyrgyzstan youth how to go viral. Spinning kittens for science and motion sickness. The National Institutes of Health, NIH, spent $1,513,299 on a study of waste and cruelty. Cats dipated. The Department of Defense, DoD, spent $10,851,439 on Orwellian cat experiments. More ducking waste in Mexico. The Department of the Interior, DOI, spent $720,479 on wetland conservation projects for ducks in Mexico. Big Bird goes to Baghdad. The Agency for International Development, USAID, is spending $20 million on Alan Simsim, a new Sesame Street show in Iraq. News we wish was fake. The Department of State, DOS, sent $253,653 to Bosnia to fight misinformation. Abandoned ship. The Navy sinks billions on LCS vessels. The U.S. Navy is set to waste almost $90 billion on ineffective Navy vessels, dragging tax dollars onto thin ice. The National Endowment for the Arts, NEA, awarded the Bearded Ladies Cabaret a $10,000 grant to support a cabaret show on ice skates focused on climate change. Taxpayers get spun. The Department of State, DOS, allocated $32,596.12 for breakdancing. As the average American taxpayers struggle to pay rent, their hard-earned dollars are ironically funneled into more real estate, Uncle Sam's, deserted buildings, and storage facilities. A recent Government Accountability Office, GAO, report highlights a glaring inefficiency. Our government senselessly wasted nearly $10 billion on empty offices. Most federal offices are ghost towns, with 17 out of 24 agencies using only 25% or less of their space in 2023. Even the busiest offices barely reach 50% capacity. This problem predates the pandemic, but COVID-19's telework boom made it worse. These buildings were underused even before we all learned how to unmute ourselves on Zoom. The GAO calculated building capacity based on usable square feet per employee. It found that many of these buildings are just oversized, expensive storage units for empty desks. In addition to the whopping $2 billion annual maintenance cost, the federal government is spending $5 billion on leases. This isn't a new issue either. In a 2022 waste report, I noted the government spent $1.7 billion on 77,000 empty and used properties. Despite empty offices, the federal government also spent $3.3 billion on high-end office commodities between 2020 and 2022. To share just a couple examples, while the CDC fearmongered the American public into closing schools and wearing ineffective masks, it was busy installing solar-powered picnic tables, costing a total of $237,960. Another example of this outrageous spending comes from the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation's PBGC $15 million splurge on new furniture even though its offices largely remain empty. The GAO's findings are a call to action. It's time to get serious about office space management, trimming down on unused space and not spending our hard-earned cash to furnish those empty offices could save a bundle, freeing up funds for more pressing needs, like literally anything else. Amidst the serene Floridian beauty, a dark tale of modern piracy unfolds. Patrick Parker Walsh, a Florida businessman turned pandemic plunderer, made headlines for his audacious escapades. He stole nearly $8 million in federal COVID-19 relief funds to buy Sweetheart Island, a private paradise of his own. This bold act of fraud, which led to his sentencing to 66 months in federal prison, sheds light on a saga of taxpayer dollars gone astray and governmental mismanagement. The court documents illustrate brazen acts of deceit, 16 fraudulent applications for Paycheck Protection Program (PPP) loans featuring fictitious employees and companies fabricated out of thin air. These documents outline a staggering $11,950,439 in requested PPP loan funds, of which he managed to obtain $4,996,167. Unsatisfied with one illicit endeavor, he delved into economic injury disaster loans, EIDLs, raking in an extra $2,822,000 through deceptive applications. With little oversight or accountability, the COVID-19 relief programs represented an opportunity for plunder that only Blackbeard could have imagined. Walsh's case is just one jewel in a treasure trove of governmental oversight failures where the swindlers of the pandemic relief programs ran rampant. According to an analysis by the Associated Press, individuals engaged in fraudulent activities potentially stole over $280 billion from COVID-19 relief funding, with an additional $123 billion being squandered or misused. These losses account for approximately 10% of the $4.2 trillion that the U.S. government has allocated thus far for COVID-19 relief aid. Additionally, the AP report provides some illuminating commentary. Here was this sort of endless pot of money that anyone could access, said Dan Frutchter, chief of the Fraud and White-Collar Crime Unit at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of Washington. The real casualty of this isn't just the theft of $8 million, but the erosion of trust in government. It's a cautionary tale for Congress and federal agencies. Always read the fine print, especially when safeguarding $4.20 trillion of Americans' hard-earned money from the clutches of modern-day pirates. This is the end of Part 1. If you would like Part 2, please comment Part 2 below.